The 9 days were the longest of Callum's life, and also, in some way he couldn't yet articulate, the most honest. The escape pod had enough oxygen for 14 days, enough water rations for 12, enough emergency lighting to make the interior glow a dim amber that he quickly learned to associate with a specific quality of being completely alone. There was no communication array. The Aurelius's pods had been built before the treaty revisions mandated long-range distress beacons, a cost-cutting measure from an era when the war looked winnable, and so he drifted in a bubble of amber light through the debris field of what had been, 11 hours prior, the most sophisticated human fleet assembled in a generation. He didn't look out the porthole for the first 3 days. He knew what was out there. He had watched the external camera feed during the battle itself, crouched on the floor of the server room with the download progress bar frozen at 63%, and he had seen the shapes of ships breaking apart at distances that made them look like toys. The Meridian going first, her reactor breach painting the vacuum orange for exactly 4 seconds. The Castellan listing and then simply ceasing, all at once, as though a decision had been made. The flagship Orion holding position for 40 minutes past when any tactical logic supported it, burning her secondary batteries until they melted, before a Karath tidal strike found her porthull and the feed from that sector of the camera went white. He had been trying to save the navigational data. That was his assignment. Ensign Callum Voss, 22 years old, posted to the Aurelius 9 months ago fresh from the academy at Threshold, where he had graduated 41st in a class of 43 and been assigned to system support because his reflexes were good but his instincts, in the words of his evaluation, showed persistent hesitation under pressure conditions. They weren't wrong. He had sat in that server room for 11 hours with his hands on a console that wasn't doing anything useful while 80,000 people died outside, and his hands had not shaken once, which he had since come to understand was a kind of indictment. The download completed at R7, by which point there was nothing left to navigate to. He had stayed in the server room anyway. The emergency seals held. When the pod launch sequence initiated automatically at the destruction of the command section, the room's emergency protocol had locked him into the nearest available unit and jettisoned him before he fully understood what was happening. He came to rest in the debris field trailing the Aurelius's grave with the camera feed still running on his wrist terminal, recording everything it could see of what was left. On the 4th day he looked out the porthole. He spent 6 hours looking. What he saw was a kind of negative space, the shape of a battle defined by absence, by the locations of things that were no longer there. Wreckage, yes, but the wreckage was already dispersing, already becoming part of the larger indifferent geometry of the deep field. In 40 years none of it would be recognizable. In 100 years the coordinates would be a footnote. On the 7th day he began reviewing the camera footage. He told himself it was because he needed something to do. He told himself it was professional obligation. He was, after all, still technically on duty, still technically an officer of the combined human fleet, and an officer in his position ought to document what could be documented. He told himself it was not because he had seen something at hour 4 of the battle, something at the edge of the camera's range, something he couldn't explain, and had spent 3 days not thinking about it as carefully as he'd ever not thought about anything. The footage was 80 hours of uncompressed external feed, captured from the camera array on the pod's underside. Most of it was aftermath. But the first 11 hours were the battle itself, grainy and distance blurred and terrible, and at hour 4, timestamp 4 hours 17 minutes and 33 seconds, there was a figure outside the Aurelius's hull. Not in a suit. Or rather, in something that was not a standard EVA suit, something that moved wrong, something that clung to the hull plating with a familiarity that no standard-issue equipment could explain. The figure was working at one of the exterior relay junctions, the secondary communications array, Callum realized after a moment, the one that handled encoded long-range burst transmission. The battle was at its peak intensity. Every gun on the Aurelius was firing. And this figure was outside, moving with calm precision, doing something to the relay that Callum couldn't quite see but could describe by its effect. At timestamp 4 hours 19 minutes and 2 seconds, all burst transmission from the Aurelius went silent. The figure had dark hair, cut short. The figure moved with a particular economy, each gesture doing exactly what it needed to do and no more. The figure, before dropping back to an airlock at 4 hours 21 minutes and 17 seconds, turned once, turned directly toward where the pod camera would be mounted, as though they knew it was there, and the distance was too great for Callum to see a face clearly, but he could see enough. He could see the proportions were slightly wrong in the way that half-Karath proportions were always slightly wrong to human eyes. The elongation through the torso, the particular set of the shoulders, the way the figure held stillness with a quality that was not quite human stillness but something more deliberate, more chosen. He ran the timestamp again. And again. and sat in the amber light of the pod for the remaining 2 days of drift thinking about what it meant that someone had silenced the Aurelius's long-range transmitters 4 hours into the battle, and the battle had still lasted 7 more hours and ended with 80,000 dead. He was thinking about it when the rescue ship found him. Threshold Station in the aftermath of Kesran was not a place so much as a condition. Callum had been to Threshold before. Everyone passed through Threshold, the great hub station at the edge of human-controlled space, rotating slowly in the dark with its 14 residential rings and its treaty offices and its fleet coordination center, but he had never seen it like this. The flags were at half-mast, which on a station meant the lighting in the public corridors had been shifted to a lower, more amber register, and the effect was that the entire station seemed to be lit the way his pod had been lit, and he had to focus on his breathing to keep that association from doing something to him. They put him in a debriefing suite on Ring 7 within 4 hours of docking. The suite had good furniture and no windows and a water dispenser that produced water tasting faintly of recycled aluminum, and he sat in it for 2 hours before anyone came to speak to him. When they did, there were 3 of them, a fleet admiral named Sorensen, a woman from the Office of Information Management whose name he was not given, and a junior officer who took notes and did not look at Callum directly. Sorensen was not unkind. That was the first thing Callum noticed. He had expected anger, the reflexive human need to make someone accountable, and who more available than the only person who had walked off the ship, but Sorensen was not angry. He was something more controlled than anger, something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into a careful, measured professionalism that Callum found, somehow, more frightening. "We need your account of the battle," Sorensen said. "Everything you observed. Everything you heard. Everything you can recall." "I was in a server room," Callum said. "I was downloading navigational data." "We understand. But you were aboard. You may have information you're not aware of having. The data I downloaded is useless. Whatever the navigational array was pointing at before the battle isn't. We're aware. We'd still like your full account." He gave it. He talked for 3 hours, and as he talked he understood that he was being watched for something specific, that the woman from Information Management was measuring his words against some template she carried in her head, and he told them everything he remembered about the battle except for one thing. He did not mention the figure on the hull. He did not mention the camera footage. He looked at Sorensen's careful face and Sorensen's careful eyes, and something in him, some instinct sharpened by 9 days of solitary thought, told him to be quiet about that particular fact until he understood it better. When they were done with him, he was assigned quarters on Ring 7 and told he was not to speak to media personnel and that he would be required for further debriefing sessions over the coming week. He nodded at everything. He went to his quarters. He sat on the bed with the wrist terminal in his hands and looked at the footage for a long time. The families came on the 3rd day. He had been warned about this, warned in the specific bureaucratic way that institutions warn you about things they cannot prevent, which is to say obliquely and with considerable paperwork, and still he was not prepared for the way it felt to stand in the corridor outside the family liaison office and have a woman with grey-streaked hair grip his arm and ask him if he had seen her daughter's ship go down. Her daughter had been on the Castellan. He had watched the Castellan die. He said "I'm sorry," and she said "Did it happen fast?" and he said yes, which was true, and which was the only mercy he had to offer anyone. The media found him twice despite the restriction. The second time, a reporter named Adisa pressed a recording device toward his face in the commissary and asked him how it felt to be the sole survivor of Kesran, and Callum said, "I don't know yet," which was the most honest answer he had ever given to anything, and Adisa looked at him with a sharpness that suggested she understood it was honest, and said, "Ensign, do you believe Command is telling the full story about what happened?" He looked at her. She looked back. "I think I need more coffee," he said, and walked away. He went back to his quarters and he opened the footage and he watched the figure on the hull, and then he started working. The station's internal network was not secure in the way that administrators believed it to be secure, which is to say that it was secure against external intrusion and almost entirely porous to anyone already on the inside with a systems background and 9 months of experience on a fleet flagship's network architecture. Callum had spent most of his time on the Aurelius in exactly the kind of access-adjacent position that left you knowing where the gaps were. He wasn't proud of this. He used it anyway. He started with what he knew, half Karath, female or presenting as female based on proportion and build, intelligence background based on the technical precision of the hull work, false identity aboard the Aurelius based on the fact that no half-Karath personnel appeared in the Aurelius's manifest. The Aurelius had carried 412 crew. 1 had survived. He was it. So whoever this person was had either died in the battle or escaped some other way, and if they had escaped, Threshold was where you ended up. He ran a search on the station's arrivals log for the 72 hours surrounding the battle's aftermath. The log was not technically accessible to him at his clearance level, but the gap his access slid through was the same gap he'd found on the Aurelius, a legacy permission node left over from an older network architecture that the administrators had never scrubbed. He found 11 entries flagged for secondary verification, personnel whose travel documentation had triggered the automated anomaly detection system. Of those 11, 3 had been cleared after review. Of those 3, 1 had arrived at threshold 2 days after the battle on a civilian courier vessel, a route that made no tactical sense for a military survivor but excellent sense for someone moving quietly. The entry listed a name, Everin Sewell. Species designation, human. The species designation was listed with a confidence metric he'd never seen before on a manifest entry, a small asterisk that linked to a secondary file he didn't have clearance to access at all. He stared at the asterisk for a long time. He ran the name through the station's public directories and found nothing. He ran it through the fleet roster and found a ghost entry, a name that existed in the system with a unit assignment and a service record, but when he tried to pull the service record the file returned empty. Not restricted. Empty. The name had been placed in the system to satisfy automated cross-references and nothing more. He went to the commissary. He sat where he could see every entrance. He thought about what it meant that someone had gone to the trouble of building a false identity strong enough to survive fleet manifest verification, and what it meant that the same person had been outside during the battle doing something to the communications relay, and what it meant that they were here. He thought about the woman who had asked him if her daughter's ship had died quickly. He thought about 37 ships. He thought about 11 hours. He put his coffee down and went to find Everin Sewell. The station had 14 residential rings and 2 administrative rings and a docking complex that connected to all of them. Ring 12 was the lowest traffic residential ring, assigned primarily to transit personnel, people passing through rather than stationed here, people who preferred not to be noticed. The entry for Everin Sewell listed a Ring 12 accommodation unit. Callum stood outside the unit's door for 4 minutes before he knocked. No one answered. He tried the room's intercom and got the standard away message prompt. He stood in the corridor with the recycled air moving past him and thought about what he would say when the door opened, and could not come up with anything satisfying. He went back to his quarters and spent 4 hours reviewing the footage again, isolating every moment the figure was visible, cleaning the image resolution frame by frame using the terminal's processing tools until he had the best possible still at 4 hours 18 minutes and 44 seconds. The figure half-turned at the relay junction, one hand braced on the hull plating, the proportions clear, the dark hair clear, the quality of attention in the posture clear even across the distance. He printed the still on the terminal's document output. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He went back to Ring 12 the next morning. And this time, when he turned the corner to the corridor, there was a woman coming from the opposite direction, and she stopped when she saw him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the low amber station light. She was exactly the right height. She moved with exactly that economy. Her eyes were the particular deep grey that Karath inheritance sometimes produced, almost no distinction between iris and pupil, the kind of eyes that made people uncomfortable because they couldn't tell where the gaze was directed. She was wearing a civilian transit worker's uniform that fit her well and was entirely wrong for her in some way Callum couldn't articulate except that she was wearing it the way people wear clothing they've selected for camouflage rather than comfort. "Ensign Voss," she said. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected to have to explain himself. "You know who I am," he said. "You're the only person who survived the Aurelius." She said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "It wouldn't have been difficult to anticipate you looking. Your name isn't Everin Sewell." "No. What happened to the communications relay?" She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was empty. He'd noticed she'd timed her approach to coincide with the shift rotation, when this section would be at minimum traffic. That, too, told him something. "Come inside," she said. The room was standard Ring 12 issue, functional, anonymous, the kind of space designed to leave no impression. She had left no impression on it. There was nothing personal visible, no evidence of occupation beyond the slight displacement of the air that comes from someone living in a space for a few days. She sat in the room's single chair. He sat on the edge of the bed because there was nowhere else to sit and tried not to think about how much this felt like a debrief. "Tell me what you saw," she said. "You were outside the hull at hour 4. You did something to the secondary communications array. All long-range burst transmission from the Aurelius went dark at 4 hours 19 minutes and 2 seconds. I have the external camera footage documenting this." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think it means?" "I think it means you silenced us. I think 7 more hours of battle happened after you silenced us, and I can't work out whether silencing us caused those 7 hours or prevented something worse." He paused. I think someone in this building is expecting you to disappear before anyone else asks that question. Something shifted in her face. Not much. Just enough. What's your name? He said. Your real one. Varel, she said. That's sufficient. He took the folded print from his pocket and put it on the bed between them. She glanced at it and then back at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite respect but lived in the neighborhood of both. You cleaned the image. I had 9 days in a pod. She was quiet. He waited. He had learned, in 9 days of being alone with his own thoughts, the value of not filling silence. The relay, she said finally, was being used to transmit targeting coordinates. He went very still. To whom? To the Karath Command Network. Specifically to the tidal strike batteries that took the Orion. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed for a long time and are finally relieved to say. The Aurelius's secondary array had been modified, before the battle, weeks before, to run a passive relay on a Karath spectrum frequency. It was feeding them our position data, our shield frequencies, our firing solutions. Everything. The room felt smaller than it had been. You shut it down, Callum said. 4 hours in. When I found it. Why didn't you report it? She looked at him, and her grey eyes were very direct, and she said, because the modification was made by someone with flag-level access to the Aurelius's systems. And because when I attempted to access the ship's internal comm to report, I found the internal comm was also compromised. And because by the time I understood the full extent of what I was looking at, I was outside on the hull and the Aurelius had 47 minutes left to live. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, someone in command fed the Karath our entire tactical architecture. Yes. Someone in command let 80,000 people die. No, she said, and her voice was careful in the way that very precise people are careful with imprecise statements. Someone in command chose 80,000 people. He didn't understand the difference and she could see he didn't, and she didn't explain it, not yet. She stood up. She looked at the print on the bed. The footage, she said. All of it. Where is it? On my terminal. Backed up in 3 locations on the station network. She nodded once, slowly, and then she said, don't trust the debriefing sessions. Don't tell Sorensen about this conversation. Don't tell anyone yet. She picked up the print and looked at it. I'll find you again. When I have the rest. The rest of what? She put the print down. She looked at him. The reason, she said. Varel did not find him the next day or the day after. What found him instead was his 4th debriefing session, which was different from the first 3 in a way he catalogued carefully. Sorensen was not present. The woman from information management was present, and this time she brought 2 colleagues he hadn't seen before, and the quality of their attention was sharper, more directed, focused specifically on what he had seen in the moments before evacuation. They asked him about the secondary communications array 3 times in 3 different phrasings, which was either a standard interviewing technique or a tell, and Callum answered each version of the question the same way. He had been in the server room, he had not been near the communication systems, he had not observed anything relevant to communications function during the battle. After the session, he went directly to the station's secondary archive terminal in the library on Ring 4, which had a different network access profile than the terminals in the residential rings and which, more importantly, had a physical connection port that bypassed the wireless monitoring that applied to all personal terminals. He plugged in. He ran the same searches he'd run before, but this time he went deeper, into the fleet's historical operational records, into the command authority logs for the months preceding Kesran, into the fleet-level communications archive that required him to use 3 separate legacy permission nodes in sequence to access at all. He found the pattern in the logistics records. It was subtle, which was how you knew it was intentional, because accidental patterns are never that subtle. In the 4 months before Kesran, there had been a series of resupply chain modifications that had routed certain materials through a depot system controlled by a logistics contractor called Vethian Solutions. The modifications looked like standard cost optimization. They were documented with the full paper trail of a legitimate administrative decision. But if you looked at the secondary effect, the actual distribution result rather than the projected distribution, what the modifications had done was concentrate 80% of the fleet's active combat resources in the Kesran sector. Not prepared. Concentrated. Staged. He sat back from the terminal. Not a loss. A staging. He didn't fully understand yet, but he felt the shape of it. Someone had arranged for the largest fleet assembly in 50 years to be in the Kesran sector, and then had arranged for that fleet to lose, and the question was what you got by losing that way, by losing catastrophically and publicly and at a scale that would be felt for a generation. He closed the terminal and walked to the commissary and ate something he couldn't taste and thought about what you get. Varel found him on the 5th day, before dawn by station time, in the maintenance corridor behind Ring 7's residential block. He had been expecting her, had left a message in a place he was reasonably confident she had access to, a specific code embedded in the network's public maintenance log that he had constructed from the Aurelius's systems lexicon, which was the only shared reference he could be sure she'd know. She came down the corridor from the north access point and stood in front of him, and he could see by the way she was moving that something had changed since their first conversation. "They burned one of my backups," he said. "The network copy on archive node 11. It's gone." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "How many do you still have?" "2. The terminal and an isolated physical drive." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, there's a man named Devereux. Deputy Director of Strategic Planning. Has been in that position for 11 years, across 3 administrations, which is how you survive administrations in strategic planning. You make yourself the person who maintains continuity, who knows where everything is." She paused. "Devereux has been in contact with the Karath High Coordination for 8 years." He stared at her. "Not as a traitor," she said, and her voice was very careful again, very precise. "That's what I needed to understand before I could tell you. Not as a traitor. As a negotiator." "A negotiator." He said the word slowly. "He let 80,000 people." "The war has been going on for 50 years, Varel said. "In 50 years, 4 million human dead. 7 million Karath dead. 11 million. And it ends how? 2 sides that have been fighting for half a century, 2 sides that have built their entire political architecture around the conflict. It ends how, exactly?" She looked at him. "Devereux found out, 8 years ago, that there was a faction within the Karath High Coordination that wanted to end it. Not wanted to win. Wanted to end it. But neither side could survive the political cost of simply stopping. You can't stop a 50-year war by announcing you're tired. You can't tell 4 million families of the dead that you're just going to shake hands now." He was very quiet. "But," she said, "you can lose. If you lose badly enough, publicly enough, devastatingly enough, if human space loses so catastrophically that no political faction can argue for continuation, then you can negotiate a settlement that looks like the only remaining option. Not surrender. Settlement. Because you don't have anything left to fight with." She paused. Kesran was the loss they designed. Devereux and his counterpart in the Karath Coordination. They built it together. The relay modification, the targeting data, the logistics concentration, all of it. 80,000 people in exchange for ending the war before it kills 4 million more. The corridor was very quiet. The recycled air moved around them. "He's right," Callum said. Varel looked at him. "He's right," Callum said again, and his voice was steady in a way that frightened him slightly. "The math works. The logic works. I can follow every step of it, and at every step the logic works." "Yes," she said. "And the 80,000 people are still dead." "Yes." "And he chose that. He sat somewhere and chose that." "Yes. Him and 6 others whose names I have. And their Karath counterparts. 10 people total made this decision. Without authorization. Without oversight. Without telling anyone else what they were doing or why." She looked at him. "The settlement terms have been drafted. The announcement is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Threshold Station is the designated neutral site. They're going to present it as a response to Kesran, a political crisis that generated the political will to end the conflict. Which is true. They simply don't intend to explain that the political crisis was created." He thought about Sorensen's careful eyes. He thought about the woman from information management running her template against his answers. He thought about archive node 11, burned clean. "They know you have the footage," Varel said. "They know I exist. They're not certain you've connected me to the relay, but they will be. The debriefing sessions are getting more specific." "How much time?" "Days. Less than a week." He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "If they announce the settlement and it holds, if the war actually ends." "Yes," she said. "It probably holds. It's been carefully constructed. The Karath faction has the standing to deliver their side. Devereux has the political relationships to make the human political architecture accept it." She paused. "And no one ever knows why. It becomes a historical footnote, the catastrophe that finally generated the political will to end things. And Devereaux and his partners carry what they did alone, and the war is over, and 4 million people who would otherwise have died do not die. He stood in the corridor with that for a long time. But, Varel said, quietly. But, he said. The families of the 80,000, she said. They deserve to know what happened to their people. They deserve to know it wasn't an accident. They deserve to know someone chose. Yes, he said. And no single person gets to make that choice. Not even for the right reasons. Not even with right math. Not even if the outcome is everything they promised themselves it would be. You don't get to decide that 80,000 people are the price of something, in secret, without their knowledge or consent. That's not a negotiation. That's not strategy. It's not even war. She looked at him with her grey Karath-edged eyes. It's just murder with good intentions. And the road that makes is the longest road there is. He nodded. He went back to his quarters. He sat at his terminal. He thought for a long time about the woman with grey-streaked hair who had gripped his arm in the corridor and asked him if her daughter's ship had gone down fast. He thought about the reporter Adisa asking if he believed Command was telling the full story. He thought about Devereaux somewhere in this building carrying 8 years of careful, monstrous logic. He thought about 4 million people who were not yet dead. He sat with all of it for a very long time, and then he opened the terminal's broadcast interface. The station's public channel network was designed for administrative announcements, emergency protocols, and commercial broadcasting. It had 47 primary channels with relay connections to 600 secondary channels reaching every residential and commercial space on threshold. It had a security lock on the broadcast control interface that required Level 6 command authentication to override, which was high enough clearance that it was never seriously tested and low enough that it had never been given the security architecture that the truly sensitive systems received. The legacy permission node was still there. Of course it was. He had the footage loaded on the terminal in 3 separate files, the pre-battle approach, the battle itself, and the aftermath. 80 hours total. He had edited nothing. He had added a text overlay to the segment at 4 hours 17 minutes and 33 seconds through 4 hours 21 minutes and 17 seconds, not commentary, just timestamp data and coordinate references that place the hull figure in exact spatial relation to the secondary communications relay. He had added a second text overlay to the logistics analysis, the resupply modifications, the Vethian Solutions routing chain, everything he'd pulled from the historical operational records, each document displayed in full with its source citation and network access path so anyone who wanted to could retrieve the originals and verify. He had written 140 words of explanatory text and read them back 4 times and could not find anything to remove, so he left them as they were. He opened the broadcast interface. He navigated to the override channel control. He confirmed the connection to all 47 primaries with their 600 secondaries. He looked at the transmission queue for a moment, 80 hours of footage and documentation waiting to go, and then he thought about the 9 days in the pod, and the amberlight, and the shape of what he was doing, which was not heroism and not even justice exactly, but something more basic than either. Something about the right of the dead to be knowable. Something about the right of the living to make informed choices about what is done in their name. He pressed transmit. The queue began uploading. He watched the progress counter. It would take 11 minutes to push the full 80 hours into the broadcast system, and then it would play on every channel simultaneously, and whatever happened after that would happen, and he would have no control over any of it. He sat back in his chair. His hands were shaking. He looked at them with a kind of distant interest, the way you observe something happening to a body that is technically yours but feels, in this moment, like an instrument you have set down. They had not shaken during the battle. They had not shaken during 9 days of drift. They were shaking now, which told him something about what kind of thing this actually was. The progress counter reached 40%. He became aware, without looking, that someone had entered the room. The door had a manual lock that he had engaged, but the lock was the standard Ring 7 residential lock, which was not designed for anything more serious than privacy, and the person who had entered had evidently needed nothing more than a moment with a tool he couldn't name. He didn't turn around. 52%. He thought, if it's information management, they'll try to stop the transmission. He had set the broadcast to run autonomously once initiated, a dead man's switch of sorts, designed so that physical interruption of the terminal would not interrupt the transmission, which was already running in the station's broadcast server rather than from his terminal directly. But there were ways to interrupt even that, if you knew the system and moved quickly enough. He turned to look. Varel stood in the doorway. She was still wearing the transit worker's uniform. She looked at him, and at the terminal, and at the progress counter, which had reached 67%. She looked at him for a long moment with those grey eyes that gave nothing away about exactly where they were focused, and he could not tell, in that moment, what she was going to do, whether she was there to stop him or to witness or to run, whether she had decided something while he was sitting here pressing transmit. 79%. She said nothing. She looked at the counter for a moment. She looked back at him. And then she nodded once. A single, slow, deliberate movement of her head, with her eyes steady on his, and the nod said several things simultaneously. That she had known he would do this, and had decided to let him, and that the decision had cost her something she was not going to name, and that she had made it anyway, and that she was not asking for anything in return, not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not absolution. The nod was not forgiveness. It was something older than forgiveness. It was recognition. 91%. She stepped back into the doorway. She looked at him one more time. Then she was gone. 97%. He heard, faintly, the first sound from the corridor, the change in ambient station noise that meant someone had turned on a screen, that the broadcast had reached the public spaces and people were stopping to look. He heard it distantly, the way you hear sounds from outside a room when you are very focused on something inside. 100%. The terminal showed him, transmission complete. Broadcast active on all primary channels. Estimated audience, station-wide. He sat in his chair with his shaking hands on his knees and listened to the station around him begin to understand what it was watching, and he thought about Varel's nod, the weight of it, the completeness of it, the way it had carried something she would not say aloud, and he thought about whether she would get out in time. And he thought that she had 8 years of contacts and a half-Karath aptitude for stillness and a mind that had looked at the entire architecture of a conspiracy and found the relay junction in the dark, so probably she would get out. He thought about what came next, which was unknowable, which was going to be terrible in some ways and necessary in others, which was going to unfold in public on public channels for an audience that had not consented to the knowledge they were about to have. He thought about that very carefully, the thing Varel had said, you don't get to decide what people are told, any more than someone gets to decide what people are sacrificed. And he had done it anyway, had made a unilateral decision about what the public would know, had transmitted without asking, had pressed transmit on behalf of 600,000 people on this station and however many millions saw the relay. And he could follow the logic of his own choice the same way he could follow Devereaux's logic, step by step, and at every step his logic held, and at every step he knew it wasn't the same because he had not chosen anything for anyone except the information itself, had not made a cost-benefit calculation about lives, but he could also see that from a certain angle it looked the same, someone deciding alone what others deserved to know, and he was going to carry that complexity for the rest of his life, and he understood that now. He sat in his chair. His hands were still shaking. Somewhere on this station, Varel was moving through corridors, and soon she would be somewhere else, and eventually she would be gone from everywhere he had access to, and he would not be able to find her again. He understood this. She had told him what she needed to tell him and let him do what he needed to do and nodded once and gone, which was the entirety of what she had offered, which was, he realized, everything. The sounds from the corridor were louder now. He could hear voices, more than one, the quality of a public space becoming very quiet all at once and then filling with a different kind of noise. Callum Voss, 22 years old, sole survivor of the Battle of Kesran, sat in his chair on Ring 7 of Threshold Station and listened to the world begin to change in ways he would not be able to predict or control, and breathed, and waited for whatever came through the door.